Welcome everyone to our panel discussion on AI and feudalism. We are going to talk about three separate themes tonight. The first one is, what is the nature of corporate tech power, the power that tech companies hold over citizens, people, and governments? We're also going to talk about the effects and implications of that power on different regions in the world, on different communities, on different continents. And we're also going to talk and deconstruct, and I shall say also criticize the framing of this panel and talk a bit about the images and metaphors we use to talk about the power of tech companies. For this panel, we have three speakers. I think all of these three don't necessarily need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. I'm incredibly excited about the conversation we're going to have, because each of our speakers brings with them a unique perspective on the key central themes of this panel. First of all, we have Evgeny Morozov. He's an American writer and researcher who studies the political and social implications of technology. Morozov's writings have appeared in various newspapers and magazines around the world. His books include The Net Delusion, The Dark Sides of Internet Freedom from 2011, and To Save Everything, Click Here from 2013. Morozov is also the initiator of The Syllabus, an internet newsletter that I highly recommend, which was launched in 2019. Next, we have Sophie Zhang. Sophie became a whistleblower after spending 2 years and 8 months working at Facebook and failing, in her own words, to fit the company from within. She personally caught 2 nations using Facebook to manipulate their own citizenry, while also revealing concerning decisions made by Facebook regarding inauthentic behavior in Indian and US politics. Formerly a data scientist, Sophie currently stays at home to pet her cats, which sounds glorious and amazing. And finally, we have next to me here present, Renata Ávila Pinto. She's an international human rights lawyer working at the intersection of tech, politics, and experimental multilateralism. I will ask her to define that fancy-sounding word for us later. She is an affiliate with the Stanford Institution of Human-Centered AI. She co-founded the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithm, the Progressive International, and the Polylateral Association. So thank you very much, everyone. We are going to start this discussion by I'm asking each of our three speakers to start with a brief statement. And the question I want to ask each of you, and Evgeny, we'd love to start with you, and then with Sophie, and then Renata, because we figured it makes sense to have you first because you're on screen. And the question that I would like to ask you is, what is the nature of tech, the nature of power that dominant tech companies hold? And which images and metaphors do you use in your work to describe them? We are having some...
Anything but America. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, no. Great. No, I was just saying that it's a pleasure to be with you. I have to correct you. I'm anything but American. So you must have gotten it off the wrong Wikipedia page. But apart from that, I also am not a big believer in the concept of feudalism as an adequate concept to think about power of technology firms. I actually think that their power, by and large, is a consequence of the power granted to them by the state and the politics and the political sphere, which was definitely not the kind of power that feudal lords and overlords were enjoying, which were operating in a complete legal vacuum without actually robust state structure behind it. And when we position technology and technology firms as somehow being this all-powerful entities that are on the cutting edge of exploiting all of us for their benefit, we're kind of letting the politicians off the hook. And I think we shouldn't do that. I mean, the reason why so many of them enjoy the power that they do, it's not just because the politicians are inadequate for coming up with rules to tame them. It's partially because they serve certain functions and interests within the modern, neoliberal state. Some of them have to do with security and surveillance. Others have to do with the way in which they, bit by bit, come to replace the welfare state in offering privatized education, healthcare, and many other services. It's not happening by accident. I would argue it's happening almost by design, and we have to be aware of that. And I think we should be very cautious not to follow the wrong path in thinking that this is all happening autonomously and this is just an industry that's out of bounds and we need to regulate that. I think that view is a little bit too naive. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate them, but we should also understand how they fit within the broader infrastructure and architecture of modern capitalism.
Thank you very much for this. Sophie, what is your take on the question? What is the nature of tech companies' power, and what images and metaphors do you think we should use to describe this power?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm also going to critique the framing myself in that I don't think feudalism is an effective or accurate way to describe it. I mean, certainly it's attention-getting and it's quite charged, but I think it does a disservice to the conversation by using this framing. And I would describe companies like Facebook, etc., technology companies, as having soft power and self-interests that are essentially equivalent to a world government. And many countries now recognize this effectively, like many nations, including Austria, now appoint technology diplomats that go to Silicon Valley and do not represent the country to another country, they represent the country to companies in Silicon Valley. And I do want to also point out that the increased role of social media companies, I mean, many of us are looking at this from a Western perspective, but it's not necessarily for good or ill. It can also act as a counterbalance in authoritarian countries. Like I myself, I was just a random American at her second job, but I was able to effectively hold the governments of Honduras and Azerbaijan responsible, which is something that dictators are not necessarily used to, frankly. Because, I mean, to people in the United States, in Europe, there are accountable institutions to answer to, but in countries like Azerbaijan that are effectively dictatorships, where all the power lies in the hands of the president, social media companies can effectively act as a counterbalance. I'm certainly not excusing the role and power of social media companies. I'm just attempting to explain that it's more complex than the simple framing that the premise of this panel uses.
Thank you so much for this. And moving on to you, Renata, what's your take on the initial question?
Yeah, my take is, it might be an interesting one. I mean, I come from a country that has been colonized so many times, Guatemala. And the way I see it and the metaphors I use, like, I mean, it's very similar when I was, when you are in first grade, like you are 7 or 8 years old in Guatemala, and you are thought on how the Spanish arrived and brought all the good, shiny stuff, because you didn't know anything before, because your knowledge was not valuable and your science was meaningless, and you had to be like, educated natives. It feels a lot like that. It feels a lot like that. The dynamic, it is an imposition. I mean, there's 3 types of countries, and I have developed that differentiation in my work. There's the countries producing the technology and driving the development, basically US and China. Then the in-between space that it is Europe and some other developed countries, I will put there, like, to some extent, Korea and Japan. In the in-between, they cannot really compete with the leaders, but they kind of produce their own things, And then the rest of us. And the rest of us receive this technology as power, technology as politics, And the metaphors, I mean, it's very close to what the Spanish crown did in Latin America. The same way that they design our squares, and they design the way we speak, and the language that we use, and they imposed a currency, imposed a system in us, is being repeated again by companies, by tech companies. And they don't meet with us. They don't care at all what an individual user in a developing country thinks or can contribute with. We are just data points. We are just, resources, the same way gold and emeralds were resources in the colony time. The only thing that matters is how our landlords, our government, fake governments, work the same way that the assistants to the Spanish crown work in the past, just welcoming them as envoys, as the tech envoy now is like the same way that the one that the King of Spain will send to our countries to get the deal sealed and extract everything. Sometimes, with consent, sometimes in a violent way, the same way, the same is repeating again. And that's what we have. We have been reprieved from the opportunity of having, a different tech future. We can discuss later on ways to get out of this dynamic, but the dynamic that we have today is, we cannot even dream of the welfare state that Evgeny was describing. We don't have welfare state because before, these tech envoys, we had, very intense processes of privatization and austerity. Because we cannot isolate what's happening in the tech world, what happened with the economic system, and what happened with the military operations in the meantime, because all goes hand in hand. So it is I would say that the metaphors is, the colonial past repeating itself, and this new mix of tech power with military power, with political power, and a new form of brutal extraction that is more invisible than it was in the past.
Thank you so much for these thoughts. So we had different themes. Evgeny, you mentioned, or you stressed the fact that the power of tech companies has ultimately been granted by the state. Sophie, you mentioned the fact that the feudalism metaphor does a disservice to the discourse, because you see the power that, in your own work at Facebook, you've seen the power of the company more as a sort of soft power, which is positive end, if I may reword what you said, negative, but can also be, you said it's negative, but it can also, there are instances where leaving out the negative positive, but it also means that authoritarian governments can be held accountable. Let's talk about this more in detail, because I think these are really difficult or nuanced conversations, and I want to get this right, what each of you are saying. There are a few questions that I wanted to ask each of you individually, so I'm going to do this first before we move towards the discussion. Evgeny, apologies for getting your nationality wrong. I was also surprised this was in the official bio for the conference. I really liked your work, and I do like your work over the past 10 years, because you're a contrarian sometimes, and in your work you've always been calling out the hypocrisy and flaws in dominant narratives and discourses. I think from the perspective of 2011, it's really 2021, it's hard to remember for some what the discourse was like in 2011 when you wrote The Dark Side of Internet Freedom. So the narrative in 2011 was really that the internet is inherently democratizing and a technology that will bring inherently freedom to countries around the world. What I've been wondering, how do you see the discourse changed in the past 10 years? Is it the discourses that are changing, or is the technology itself radically different than it was in 2011?
Well, I think, look, we've seen almost a radical swing to the opposite pole. But let me before I say that, let me maybe unpack a little bit the arguments I was trying to make around 2010, 2011. My main argument was not that somehow the internet is bad while everybody thinks that it's good. My main argument was that what we call the internet takes on this apolitical, historical shape of a medium, of a technology. And as we start framing everything as it was caused by the internet, it was caused by Facebook, it was caused by Twitter. I remember back then we were used to talk about Twitter revolutions and Facebook revolutions and then whatnot, that basically conceals much more interesting and complicated processes that have to do with politics and economics and history that actually have given us the technologies we have, and the technologies are the consequences of those processes by and large and not the main drivers. And then, of course, because we had a very utopian, optimistic, rosy, ahistorical account of capitalism, even a year after the financial crisis, we were still kind of, I think, believing in the idea that as digital technologies, which was a euphemism for digital capitalism, spreads around the planet and conquers the globe, it will bring democracy and freedom and growth everywhere it went. And I think by and large, we have solely replaced the positive side with the negative one. But the way of talking and framing these issues as something driven by some anonymous, autonomous force called technology or the internet or social media, it's still there. So, we by and large still operate with that extremely techno-deterministic conception. I used a very specific term in my first book. I called it internet centrism. That internet centrism is still there, just that now instead of coupling itself to techno-utopianism, it couples itself to techno-dystopianism. But it's still an extremely shallow, ahistorical, and I would even argue apolitical framework that is incapable of thinking outside itself, which is why it cannot offer any alternative vision of how to organize digital infrastructures in the service of a better political project, because it doesn't have a better political project. So all it can do is just to go and recover these tools that we inherited from a century ago, antitrust, let's break up these companies the way we broke up oil companies, etc., because ultimately we cannot think beyond the market. We might make the market more competitive, but we have lost, or maybe in some cases never acquired, the capacity to think about technology as a set of institutions. And we do not know what institutions we want in place. And that refers both to data, but also to artificial intelligence and to all the other layers of the stack. So, my assessment of how the debate has changed would unfortunately be negative, because it hasn't. We've seen as a shift from one extremely shallow way of talking about political change to another one, but it's still as shallow as it was before.
A follow-up question on this. You're quite critical of the term surveillance capitalism that has become quite popular in the past few words. Can you explain a bit more how you view this concept in light of what you just said about the shallowness with which the analysis often happens?
Well, my problem with surveillance capitalism is that it says very little about surveillance and even less about capitalism. So, on the surveillance side, it again presents these firms by and large as independent actors and not as consequences of the military-industrial complex that has emerged in America and was then, expanded to Europe. To me, the fact that there is some kind of hypothetical behavioral manipulation happening, as Google shows as an ad, it's problematic. Is it as problematic as having NSA operate surveillance bases all over the planet? I don't know. So why should we be prioritizing, the Googles and the Facebooks and this account as opposed to the NSA, or at least be presenting them as a natural extension of a certain geopolitical and military model? Likewise, with regards to capitalism, it's not, surveillance capitalism is not an account that seeks to look beyond capitalism as an institution. It just seeks to create or perpetuate a somewhat different, maybe more humane type of capitalism, where instead of Facebook and Google, you're going to have Apple. And Apple, before they started announcing they might be looking at your phone to find, child pornography photos. It's this idea that you can actually switch to a different business model where consumers would pay a premium of, 200 euros on every device for better privacy. And that would kind of grant us the autonomy that we want. And essentially, if you look at this argument closely, it promises you autonomy by means of greater participation in the market. It's as capitalist as you can imagine it. So my problem with surveillance capitalism as a concept is that a lot of people mistake it for something deeply emancipatory, radical, and anti-systemic, while in fact it's extremely pro-systemic and it's not particularly anticipatory, and by and large it can also be an extremely conservative position. So as long as we don't have any illusions about that concept, you can use it all you like, but then, you know, to me it's not very different from, you know, people who have good things to say about neoliberalism. You know, they can exist, they're my opponents. What really makes me sad is that a lot of people who I thought were my allies cannot see through that rhetoric. And that's the saddest thing about, you know, a concept like surveillance capitalism, but it's definitely not the only one. There are many others, which again, to me, are a consequence of just our ultimate political and historical confusion with regards to our inability to see technology as a set of historical and political institutions, because it's only by seeing it through that lens that we would be able to develop alternative ones.
Renata, I can see you reacting quite strongly to this. What is your reaction?
Well, it says many reactions because, I mean, maybe I'm seen from different perspective and from different place. And I do agree with many of the things that Evgeny said, and I also see a different dynamic, you know, because I want to go back a little bit, like almost 20 years back in time, you know, and I think there was an honest attempt of thinking beyond the market when thinking about technology, and we were very naive. And I speak here on behalf of mistakes that were made by, you know, I think that we, like, if we equate it to this, you know, like colonialism analogy that I was saying, like, we were the bad missionaries of openness.
Can you give some examples to this?
Like, yes, so the open, there was a group of well-intentioned, well-educated people that were thinking beyond the market. They were thinking, you know, that another digital world was possible. You know, I can think of indie media, the free software movement, the early Wikipedians. You know, like we thought that technology had the possibility to unlock the democratization of knowledge, and that democratization of knowledge, we were very naive of thinking, removing barriers and removing frictions of this daring new world where we will democratize access to knowledge will bring an incredible era of prosperity for developing countries, and it will be like a big equalizer. And I think that Sophie might be very familiar with this rhetoric, you know, connect everybody, like make access will be access to these kind of crappy technologies that we have today will emancipate people. That was like many of the things discussed by Evgeny in his early work. It was such a trap and such a lie. And what we have today is no longer, you know, it's not surveillance capitalism. It's a form of techno-brutalism. I see it in my country. You know, I see it manifest in ways people are not connected to emancipatory tools at all. It is a new form of surveillance and control and maximum exploitation managed by machines, by profit machines, not even neglecting the human, ignoring completely the human. And people get, like, you know, the same way that slaves were like subject to like harsh, you know, systems enforced by humans. Now it is a system enforced by, you know, algorithms. You see the delivery guy in my country rushing because it will get, you know, like get lower point, lower score because of a delivery. You see the delivery guy in some extreme cases that doesn't even understand your language, hurrying in this, like, you know, non-stop system of exploitation. And all the think beyond the market that we did in the first decade of the century was completely a trap of well-intentions that were, like, you know, then captured by the system that is still up to this day sells open and sells sharing as values that should be embraced, and that and it extrapolated to even AI world. You know, open transparency, and it's going to be good because AI is good because it's good.
I want to talk a little bit about the term feudalism assumes that we all relate in a similar way to the powerful system, to the overlords. whereas in reality, risks and harms are very unequally distributed. And there are also, as you mentioned already, the effects of this power are felt very differently depending on where you are. Sophie, I read an article in I think the MIT Tech Review in which you were interviewed, and you said the sentence describing your work at Facebook that struck with me. So you said, "It increasingly felt like I was trying to empty the ocean with a colander." So you worked at the fake engagement team, so identifying things like fake likes, if I understand correctly, or inauthentic behavior. But then noticed that there were pages, and that includes, of course, pages run by politicians, who were able to create multiple accounts, which is something that is not allowed on Facebook for normal user accounts. So essentially, you discovered a gap in the system. Have I summarized this correctly? Sort of. Good enough. I think the question I have is, from the outside, these companies look like they are a black box. So I'm really curious, and of course only if you feel comfortable talking about this, how are policies developed at Facebook and how are they being enforced around things like fake engagement, etc.?
So policies at Facebook. So again, I did not work on this myself. I mean, this is just what I picked up from working inside this company and listening to other people and etc. I mean, policies at Facebook are developed by people who actually work on it, but who are generally motivated by outside factors like this is bad and we aren't catching it. I would continue the technology companies as government metaphor in that essentially the policies set up by these companies are the equivalent of laws, and so like they take time to develop, and there are people who enforce them and decide how they're enforced. But the difference between actual countries and technology companies is that the people developing the policies and making rulings on how each case falls under each policy are the same people who are charged with keeping good relationships with local governments, politicians, and etc., which of course sets up a very conflicted sets of incentives, because Renata has strong opinions, for instance, on technology companies as having strong power and poorer countries as being exploited. From my experience working at Facebook, I would say that it's essentially a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is that it is true that Facebook pays less attention to poorer and smaller countries like Guatemala, like Honduras, like Azerbaijan, etc. That offers, at the same time, the attention that they pay to wealthier, more important countries, apologies to countries that are perceived as less important, like the United States, like India, which are very important. The priority is not necessarily what the people in those countries would like. Like in India, for instance, when I caught a member of the ruling political party, a BJP politician, red-handed, Facebook was unwilling to act, and that's probably because Facebook could not afford to lose the trust of the Indian government, because the Indian government has threatened to arrest Facebook employees if Facebook does things that are against its interests or against its desires and orders. And so, in contrast, because Azerbaijan was small countries that were not considered consequential by Facebook, the response by Facebook was much smaller, but also there was less political interference in that Facebook, the company, was much less worried about a poor reaction from those national governments when we caught their leaders, as opposed to in a country like India. And I hope this is making sense. Like ultimately, Facebook is a company, and its goal is to make money, certainly. But along with the goal of making money, it has a vested interest in receiving the general approval of the people of those countries, so they use their platform. And in countries like in democracies like the United States, like European nations, like that is the same incentive that politicians face much more clearly. And so that's and so the impact of Facebook, I would say, it's more negative comparatively in other areas. But in dictatorships, where the dictator is not beholden to the population, I would argue that Facebook can offer a counterbalance, even if a very small one. And I hope this is making sense. I'm certainly not an apologist for Facebook. I hope my record demonstrates that conclusively. But I'm leery of these strong analogies of essentially techno-dystopianism, as Evgeny put it, because that is the prevailing mood and stereotype today. But ultimately, you cannot fix problems until you understand them. And to do that, we must be able to freely discuss both the problems and their advantages.
Renata, you had thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I had the honor and opportunity to support a Latin American candidate during the elections, his election run recently, and I had to interact with Facebook, and actually interacting with Facebook was what in the past would have been to interact with the most important newspaper in the country, you know. Imagine if the most important newspaper in the country, in your country, will stop a candidate from, like, you know, sharing any political advertising for all the population. Today, Facebook is the most important newspaper, like not only Facebook, but its sub-products, WhatsApp and Instagram. It's the most important way to communicate with Latin Americans. In this specific country that I will not name, but it's South American, Facebook is like around 95% of the interaction with citizens. People do not buy newspapers anymore. They like get the news from it. Like it's like it's uber feudalism, and it's like the dominant position. It's like the absolute lord on it. And it turns out that the company decided not to authorize this person to publish, like, you know, political advertising there for months. So the competitor was like way ahead on reaching out to voters. And I got into the game, and we discovered something that it is evident of all corrupt regimes everywhere. Revolving door of elites, government officials, and Facebook. Like the same way that it happens in the US, you know, like you will have someone really hostile to this political position, authorizing or stopping this person from advertising. Like we blame often the algorithm, but actually sometimes it's more nuanced, you know, and it's easy to blame the algorithm. It's super easy to blame automation to this kind of direct censorship and blocking of a political project. I will ask. Even they had Nick Clegg from the UK government at the top of this decision pyramid. And I will write to all of them and say, like, you know, you have, according to your terms and conditions, there's no way that this candidate can be like silenced and blocked. It's not our fault. It's the automation system, something trigger it, and we cannot activate it. And, you know, like, it was for weeks and weeks. And then we discovered that the person deciding this was closely connected with the competing candidate. So one thing is the headquarters, you know, of Facebook and the decisions that happened there. And then we see, and we saw it in India as well, the local politics of elites, of right-wing elites, getting inside the company and using it to their purposes, the same way, like in colonial times, you know, corrupt, like local elites hijack the system to serve their political purposes. So it is beyond just market, and it is beyond just profit. It is a structure of domination and control of populations and elections.
I think the reason why the issue of power or the nature of the power of tech companies has become such an issue, because whether the implications are, I know the good and bad framing is maybe not the ideal one, but whether the effects of this power are sometimes positive or sometimes negative, it's a sort of power that's entirely unaccountable. So there are no real accountability mechanisms. It's a lot of power. Even for you, Sophie, in your job, you had a lot of responsibility and power, even though you weren't elected and there was no public accountability. And I want to go back to something that you said, Evgeny. You portrayed earlier sort of attempts to tackle the power of tech companies through things like competition as something that still stays within the market logic. Do you think there's anything useful or fruitful to thinking about the market dominance of tech companies at all, or not really?
I mean, you can think about it all you want. I mean, there is no problem in thinking about it. If it much depends on what do you take a radical stance vis-a-vis this industry to be, right? If you think that the most radical thing that is available to a truly progressive emancipatory project is to have 100 Instagrams instead of one, then I think we are in a pretty depressive state. And I think the reason why we don't have that discussion, it's not because the earlier efforts have failed, and this is where I disagree with Renata on this and on a few other things. I don't think that the efforts of indie media or Creative Commons or even free software to any extent were efforts to think about alternatives to capitalism. They were alternatives to think about various technologies differently and think about how you can have maybe alternative property regimes attached to specific technologies. They did not in any way try to mount a challenge to how do you organize society if you wouldn't organize it by means of the market, because they were essentially trying to achieve their own agendas in relatively narrow fields. Indie media wanted to change the media. I mean, they did not try to understand how is it that you're going to produce and reproduce society if you were no longer to rely on the capitalist system, right? And it's those debates that now need to be opened up. We are essentially looking at potentially massively powerful infrastructures. Those infrastructures can be used in different ways. They can be used to produce differently. They can be used to consume differently. They can be used to organize how we actually innovate differently, where innovation is not the prerogative of 4 or 5 big firms that all spend $15 to $20 billion on R&D every year, but each of us innovate in one way or another, and then through those infrastructures, these little mini innovations of everyday life somehow percolate to the top, right? So I mean, there are all sorts of ways and things we could be doing. The reason, the thing that's missing is the motivation, and it's the question as to why we should be thinking about it, and I don't see that questioning happen. And and the fear that I have, listening to Renata, is that there is a very interesting narrative that she's giving us. So there was colonialism, which was bad. Then came techno-feudalism, and it's even worse. And in the middle, the part that actually involves capitalism is somehow gone. Which kind of presents colonialism as almost disconnected from capitalism, which I find rather problematic. But it also presents techno-feudalism or feudalism of some kind as some kind of a worsening or maybe a radical departure for the worse from the capitalist system. And I just don't think it's true. I think that the accumulation of private power in the economic sphere by corporations is the hallmark of capitalism. It's not a deviation. It's not a bad apple. This is what capitalism is. It's making more and more of your life subject to decisions made elsewhere, whether they're made in the market or by corporations or by a certain member of the technocratic class or professorial, professional managerial class, if you want, that aligns themselves with a certain fraction of capitalists. I mean, what's new about it? I mean, that's how sabotage in bureaucracies used to happen. So there are people in Facebook who are technicians, who are aligned with right-wing candidates. To me, it's a hallmark of the capitalist system. That's how technocracy and bureaucracy and managers under a lot of capitalist regimes have traditionally behaved. So I just think that we have to be careful not to throw everything we've learned about how companies, corporations, and private actors operate out in search and in quest for fancy metaphors. I just think that there is a danger of us winning the hearts and minds of the people with these fancy metaphors, but emptying our brains because we no longer have the right analytical frameworks.
Sophie, I see you, Renata, you probably want to respond, but Sophie, I also see you nodding. Do you want to react or comment on this?
So just generally, I mean, I genuinely agree with Evgeny, and I think that the I think that to many people, the power of technology companies is something very new. But I mean, in reality, I mean, there are many companies that have had multinational power in the past, like the British and Dutch East Indian companies. They essentially ruled most of India and most of Indonesia. Like in Central America, the United Fruit Company, Noche Cuita, I mean, they were deeply involved in the politics of those countries, but probably more than technology companies in the present day, I would say, though I'm certainly not an expert or a local. I think it's important to look with that lens in mind, because I mean, to the average listener in the United States, in Europe, etc., they are not used to having technology companies have this level of power and influence in their life. But to many others in smaller countries, this may be typical or unfortunate and an unfortunate continuation of the past. And I also agree with Evgeny's framing that, I mean, breaking up the companies is not the only thing to do, because like ultimately what's going on is not, I mean, it's breaking up is a very simplistic solution, but it's not just a matter of competition. What's going on is that technology companies have incentives and have costs that are not the same as the world at large. And this is essentially what an economist would call a market failure in next year. Because, I mean, when technology enables the spread of dictatorships, the degradation of public discourse, etc., the spread of authoritarian power, this is a power that isn't paid. This is a cost that isn't paid by technology companies. It's paid by the world at large. What an economist would call an externality problem. And these are well understood. Like, for instance, cigarettes companies give people cancer. We don't expect them to reimburse governments for the costs of cancer treatment. We don't expect banks like Bank of America to keep the world financial system from crashing. And so regulation is a well-understood tool, but because the governments have failed to step in, partly because of the multinational nature of tech companies, we do have this unrealistic expectation of tech companies that's unrealistic in the sense that they'll never do it because it's against their own interests, even if it's good for the world. And ultimately, essentially the governments have failed to step in that regard, partly because of the increasing power that technology companies have had and the unfamiliarity of world governments of working together to tackle this sort of problem collectively.
I just want to take I know you want to react, and you will be able to do so. I just want to take a quick step back and just explain why I think it's so important that we do talk about the metaphors and images we use, because as someone who works in policy, they have direct consequences on what is being done. So if we frame the power of tech companies as feudalism, this evokes an image of something that happened in the past. It's almost like we're going backwards. Whereas, as I think, Evgeny, if you rename the panel AI and Capitalism, the entire framing leads to different kinds of solutions. Or if on the political spectrum, breaking up tech companies is positioned as the most radical thing to do, that leaves nothing else to be more radical, when in fact it really depends whether this is a radical solution at all. Renata, you have lots of reactions.
I have my mind into date, September 11th. And what I'm thinking of is Salvador Allende, you know, and Salvador Allende was the president of Chile, and he was imagine if Salvador Allende was alive today, probably instead of nationalizing, you know, the copper company, he will be expropriating WhatsApp for his citizens. I mean, maybe, you know, he might consider it like, you know, public infrastructure and take it back to the control of the state in the hands of the citizens for advancing a political project. And I am also, my mind is on 2021, back to 1961, when the non-aligned movement was created. Because, you know, like it is, my mind and my heart is always squeezed in this space in between, you know. My country is a space in between. It's a non-aligned space, you know. It's not super sophisticated Europe. It's not China. It's not the US. So, and connecting it to the non-aligned movement, I go back to, like, maybe we don't have the technology, like, arsenal that China and the US has. But we have the numbers, and multilateralism is still a system that works. I mean, global regulations, telecommunications regulations, airspace, war, peace is still managed by the multilateral system. And when we use these, metaphors and analogies, and we seem to have forgotten the state. And we always are constantly placing and trashing governments when they act like governments. Like recently, like, Nigerian president was really upset against Twitter and banned Twitter. But, like that's the power of a state at the end of the day. Of course, you can, like, argue democracy and many things, but at the end of the day, if a large enough group of states were agreeing on a different agenda and different set of solutions that didn't mean, like, endless litigation to fragment companies, and taking different steps in a global trade agenda on how to deal with digital, we have the numbers. We don't have the tech, but we have the numbers to imagine a different system. I might sound super naive, but I mean, I think that the achievements that a coordinated group of countries, of states, managed to do as a non-aligned movement during the Cold War, it was quite impressive. It was the post-war. It was a hard time, and a lot of progress was made. I don't see why we cannot imagine that the power of organized states can achieve and can propose an alternative to this impasse that we are in between, or at least manage to get a better deal. I just miss the leadership that Brazil had in leading that push, and I hope that some country and some group of countries will take the lead as soon as possible.
I want to circle back to something you said, Evgeny, at the beginning, where you said if we talk about the power of tech companies in terms of feudalism, I think we've all agreed that we don't like this metaphor. But you said at the beginning it makes industry sound too powerful, it lets politicians off the hook, and it ignores that it was politicians or the state that granted this power in the first place. Can you explain this a bit more, what you meant by this? The relationship between the state and tech companies specifically?
Sure. Well, here we would need to, of course, start making a lot of distinctions and specifications, because clearly the power of the American state in setting the terms on which Silicon Valley relates to itself, but also in the way in which it relates to other states, is disproportionately larger than the power of any other state, including that of China. So you essentially have to start thinking about the technology industry as an outgrowth of a certain geopolitical agenda, and the geopolitical agenda of the American state has always been creating safe space for American companies to expand abroad, and that has traditionally been the case. And European, Latin American, Asian, and African governments that found themselves in the kind of geopolitical network by desire or by accident or by force of the United States, ended up accepting American companies because that's what was required of these countries in order to remain as good and faithful allies to the United States. That's why, in Europe, we can be having, since I'm in Italy, we can be having all sorts of debates about, European sovereignty, digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty, and then once you look at the details of how this mythical Gaia X project is going to look like, you discover that it's going to feature Google, Microsoft, Palantir, and all the others, and then the question should be reasonably asked, so who are we going to be sovereign from? Right? And clearly we will not be sovereign from the American power, from the Chinese power. We will be sovereign from, some mythical hackers. So, the geopolitical considerations almost disappear from the way in which we frame the concept of technological sovereignty. And I think that they need to be brought back, but, broadly speaking, I think we do have to understand that just like Wall Street and the financial industry right before the 2007-2008 crisis had a very peculiar role and function in enabling the capitalist economy to fake prosperity by driving up housing prices and making us all who happen to own houses feel wealthy and prosperous. So does Silicon Valley. I mean, it does it in different ways, but its function to some extent is to alleviate the burden on the kind of what we used to call democratic capitalism that's supposed to redistribute goods and provide certain services like education and healthcare and communication to people, and it's just no longer done by publicly funded state institutions. It's not done by libraries or the post office when it comes to communication, by and large. It's done by private players like Google and Amazon and others, and the state does not look at it as something bad. They look at it as a great thing because it allows them to save money, it allows them to take on less debt, and it allows them to celebrate the initiative of the private sector, which fits very well with their overall kind of neoliberal orientation. So that, I think, is something that we shouldn't be blind to. Can I just say something to play on the Chilean metaphor that Renata started? I think the Chilean example actually shows you that to speak about feudalism now is inappropriate, because if you look even at the Allende era, I mean, Allende did try to nationalize the paper industry, and he failed. He couldn't because his power was not big enough to match the power of the Chilean oligarchy, which actually owned the El Mercurio newspaper, and he could do it with copper, he couldn't do it with newspapers, which shows you just how powerful the media industry was at the time, but it also shows the extent of corporate power. And of course, one of the main adversaries of Allende, and the company that actually orchestrated to some extent the coup and tried to prevent him from taking power, was ITT, which is the predecessor to AT&T, which is a telecommunications giant. And the fact that, ITT played a much bigger role in the politics of Chile than Facebook could ever dream of playing now, I think to me it's a fact. I mean, we can, of course, see where things will be in 5 or 10 years, but I think we'll be doing the service both to the Chileans and to history if we try to blow things out of proportion and say that the influence of Facebook under this techno-feudal regime is now greater on the politics of these countries than the influence of Coca-Cola or ITT was back in the 70s, under what we all agreed on was a capitalist regime, not a feudalist one.
I have to disagree, but yes,
No, you can react. I think
just very quick reaction. It is very different today. We have seen the merge of the power of the power of unregulated or captured by conservative elites social media and combined with politics. I mean, we have seen what WhatsApp is doing to Brazilian politics, for instance. I think that it is. I don't have hard facts, but my Brazilian colleagues have been documenting, the huge influence of Silicon Valley and concretely Facebook, and concretely within Facebook WhatsApp, on the deterioration of and mobilization of conservative forces destroying rights in a far bigger, far more complex country. I don't know how and why it would interfere in politics in Chile today, but I think that it is increasingly influential and powerful. Maybe not, maybe even to the extent that that company that overthrown Allende or the United Fruit Company in my country back then.
I think then the question is the power of tech companies we're seeing today historically unprecedented or not? And I think, Sophie,
I don't think it's unprecedented. I think that is history repeating itself.
Well, if history is repeating itself, it's the opposite of unprecedented, Renata. And that's, I think, is something we have to keep in mind, because the danger of presenting the current stage as exceptional and calling it feudalism is that we are whitewashing capitalism in the meantime. And I think we just should be very careful when we do that, because ultimately, just because it's in the past doesn't mean that it was less severe or less pronounced.
Sophie, what is your take on this?
I mean, I've already expressed my general take in the area, which is that I don't see current technological power as greatly more powerful than, say, the influence of the United Fruit Company in Central America and of the British East Indian Company in essentially governing most of India. And I mean, I think people who have lived under company whose countries had lived under company rule, I think would have very different reactions to them depending on how it's remembered. And while I'm here, I wanted to quickly react briefly to some comments that were made earlier. First, the discussion about Salvador Allende, and I'm sorry I mispronounced his name. I don't speak Spanish, but in Chile, I mean, I think the approach and reaction that Renata had was that such a move would be positive, though I mean that's a bit reading into it, and if so, I would have to disagree with it, because I mean because I think there are severe challenges and risks faced with having actually nationalized by the government, especially if we remember what happened to the Allende government, that it was replaced by the Pinochet regime. And so, like the governments that essentially have their own social media separate from Facebook, from Twitter, these are the governments of Russia and the People's Republic of China, which I mean certainly are not democratic countries. That use social media as a tool of control over their own nation, that use social media to control their citizenry. And if the possibility of nationalizing social media were realistic, I'm certain that dictatorships such as Azerbaijan would take that move in an instant. I also wanted to react briefly. Just Evgeny talked earlier about the surveillance capitalism of companies essentially removing privacy from communications and discussions, and as well as the discussion Renata just had of WhatsApp in Brazil deteriorating the civic discourse. I do want to point out that these are both severe concerns and important concerns, but they're somewhat opposed to one another, because a lot of the issue with WhatsApp in the first place is just the fact that it's end-to-end encrypted and has strong virality, which means that misinformation can spread freely without intervention, essentially. And anyways, that's my very quick 2 cents.
Sure. Let's take this into, I think this is a really interesting discussion, but let's take this into a slightly different direction before we open up to questions from the audience. So the entire framing of this, not just this panel, but the day here at Ars Electronica is AI. So this is the European AI Lab. And AI is, of course, a buzzword, a study I keep coming back to. There was research done that, I can't recall the correct number, but about 40% of European AI startups don't actually do AI. So they use the term because it attracts venture capital funding. So the term AI is clearly overused. But at the same time, I think when we talk about corporate power and especially the dominance of tech company, it's really interesting to, and I'd love to ask you to reflect on this, whether AI changes anything. There was a panel earlier where someone, an artist, mentioned AI as a service is something that all big tech companies offer. They have access to data that few other companies have. They run infrastructure that other companies are dependent on. So my question is this a significant new development, or is it just the latest buzzword and now we're framing all of these much more fundamental issues, such as around capitalism, in terms of AI? You can go first, whoever wants to go first.
I'll respond first, if that's all right. So I agree. I think it's both, that the development of artificial intelligence and algorithmic responses is very new and unprecedented, and at the same time, it is also a buzzword that's being thrown around. And like the very idealistic people would say that artificial intelligence and algorithmic interventions allow for decisions to be made without human input and human bias. But the reality of the situation is that it's humans who are writing those algorithms. It's humans who know what the result will be and anticipate what the result will be and won't run those algorithms if they don't like the results. Like if Facebook says it doesn't know what the impact of its algorithms have before implementing them, then it's incompetent and negligent. But with that said, like the AI certainly has a lot of influence and power that it's not necessarily what it had in the past. And what I mean by that is that the digitalization and ability to use algorithms to analyze data has essentially enabled a form of authoritarian surveillance that in certain countries, like for instance the People's Republic of China, which now has a social credit system, and to a degree that wasn't essentially feasible in the past. Like the Soviet Union is sought to control all facets of its economy, and was unable to do so effectively. And I think that would have a different outcome in the modern day and age potentially. And similarly, like the social credit system China is attempting, that would never have been feasible 100 years ago or something like that. And these are, and again, AI is a buzzword. It's used for a lot of things, from basic algorithms to full-blown machine learning algorithms to full-blown chatbots and the like. And so, for instance, here's one of the dangers that AI poses. Because I mean, many people who have lived in authoritarian regimes know that in dictatorships, dictators will feel the need to buzz in crowds of supporters to pay people to hold signs and placards supporting them, because if they give a speech to an empty crowd, an empty courtyard, then they will be seen as a failure. But if you want a crowd of 100,000 people, they have to be 100,000 actual people, and it's very hard to control that. Like the Romanian Revolution happened, the fall of Nicolae Ceausescu happened when he gave a speech to what was Palace Square in Bucharest, 200,000 people he had buzzed in to show off his power. But instead, the crowd turned on him, and the revolution started in the streets of Bucharest. The next day, the army turned on him. Within a few more days, he was arrested and given a show trial. But it's very easy nowadays for a few people to pretend to be a very large amount of people online, and especially when that's more automatable, but with, for instance, artificial intelligence, like a few people are much more easily controlled than 100,000 people. Like Ceausescu fell when his paid crowds turned on him, and I don't think anything similar will happen to the paid trolls of today's dictatorships, especially if they're able to be automated and turned over to artificial intelligence, because the fewer people are required to do something, the more easily controlled they are, and I hope that makes sense.
Evgeny, what's your take on this question?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, I think one thing I've learned from the last 15 years or so of participating in these debates is that we have to be very careful about allowing the tech industry and its minions and cheerleaders to reify the language and fix the terms on which we debate many of these concepts. I mean, we've seen that happen to quote unquote the internet, which became a very kind of fixed idea, and we all had to accept that the internet is here and it's here to stay, and what follows is disruption, and we all have to accept the consequences. And some industries like newspapers were stupid enough to actually follow this advice, and they suffered the consequences very badly, thinking that the internet has a logic and they need to adapt to it. The same then happened, I think, to how we think about cloud computing and internet search. On the question of search, we've all got accustomed to the idea that the only way you can actually find things and search for things is if a big company in Mountain View offers you a search box, and then you see some ads attached to every search you make, and this is what search is. Is it really true that that's the best way to organize search? I mean, do we really believe that the best way to find local data related to local things is by mounting our search via an institution in Mountain View as opposed to some local institution, be it a library, university, or something else. I mean, we've accepted a lot of those defaults and assumptions without actually thinking about alternative institutional arrangements and how many of the services can be provided. And the same, I think, is going to happen with AI, where we are going to accept that it's basically something that is there to serve the causes of automation, and it's to be offered by a bunch of centralized firms that need our data and our data sets in order to train it. And there is some kind of a trade-off where we give them our data and they give us the service in return, and boom, this whole thing gets reified, and we are stuck with that model for the next 15 or 20 years. And I think before we allow that to happen, we have to think a little bit more carefully about what might some of these alternative uses or framings of AI might be. Maybe instead of automation, we should be talking about prediction. And maybe if you frame it as a matter of prediction and modeling and simulation, we will find that there is a much bigger and longer discourse that surrounds it, with all sorts of previous efforts by relying on data, computers, modeling software, etc., to do the job done. And maybe modeling and simulation and prediction would be enough, because unlike automation, where we all expect perfection and some kind of binary status, it either works or it doesn't. The car either drives by itself or it doesn't drive. With prediction and modeling, you can actually have a much more open-ended conversation about how good this thing at prediction. What does it need? Do you need a model with more data? Do you need more model with local data? Do you need to structure it differently? And then you can also ask questions, what would all these new instruments and infrastructures of prediction allow you to do? I run a kind of curatorial outlet that you mentioned at the beginning, the syllabus. In 2 years of operations, we handpicked more than 90,000 items from, 1 million candidates. Obviously now, after 2 years, I can delegate and train a model, essentially, which will make those picks instead of my human editors, or it will assist them at least as much as possible, so that they can actually focus on the reading as opposed to browsing and scrolling. That I find fantastic and fascinating. But the question is, how can we give that capacity and that ability to every single organization without having to become customers of Google or Amazon, which have become the default providers of AI services, and they want to charge money for it, and they impose certain limits and conditions on what you can do. And that, to me, would be a true democratization of AI, that you can build your own model with the data you collect on your own terms, with your own sensors, infrastructures, and so on. And then, you can maybe connect to your fellow citizens who have similar needs at the level of neighborhoods, nation states, communities, etc. All of that is possible. But even to arrive at that set of questions, we need to know, why don't we like the current model? And I think because the broader critique of the politics of big tech, in my opinion, as related to our democratic future, is missing, because people on the progressive left don't actually have an alternative institutional arrangement. All they can talk about is dignity or humanity or maybe human rights, but there is no alternative to the market the way central planning was an alternative, perhaps a bad one to it during the years of the Soviet Union. That alternative is not there. And since that alternative is not there, all of our conversations about alternative uses and deployments of AI, they end up being relatively uninteresting and banal, because we do not actually know what should be our normative goal when we think about alternatives. And without that alternative goal, it's very hard. People on the other side of the aisle, the neoliberals, people on the right, they have a much clearer idea, because they know that they just want to privatize everything, have markets and contracts everywhere. So their agenda is clear, and for them AI might be wonderful, but at least they don't have to do the soul searching that their opponents need to do. And I'm afraid that the opponents, alas, have not yet realized that soul searching is in order.
There's a really interesting dynamic and field of research that looks into where in the world AI models are being trained. And we often see that this work is outsourced to places where labor is incredibly cheap. So you have entire centers in countries like Uganda where people sit all day and train AI. For example, for self-driving cars, they need to click and classify images, essentially. So, and at the same time, and I'm posing this to you specifically, Renata, the discourse around AI, at least in civil society circles, has led to, you're yawning, but it has also led to a lot of discussions around discrimination, the racialized impact of technology, and these were discussions that were previously, and I think that's fair to say, sometimes missing from debates around privacy or like surveillance capitalism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, of course. I think that it's a trend now to make those problems visible, as it is a unique characteristic of technology, and it's not society as a whole. You know, like if you have crossed borders as a non-white person, I mean, you face the same discrimination that we used to face, like you have been selectively chosen by the system to extra checks, right? And it was not random at all. There's the same bias that people had in the past. The same data that they captured fed the models of the automated discrimination and exclusion that we are experiencing today. And I will say that the difference is like, you know, how tech got involved in, like, you know, less people hired, more tech deployed in enforcement of borders, of check controls, or, you know, factories and so on. That oppression, discrimination has been automated, but at the same time, I would say, like in the positive, even if it's a buzzword, I was doing a mapping on interesting AI developments in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. It's very little. There's very little, but there's an emerging group of researchers and technologists starting to think of new models, and that's, is the imaginary possibility what gives me a little bit of hope. Quick example, in Mexico, a data scientist, a woman, she was tasked with a very massive task that was like, Mexico is like a lot of people, therefore a lot of data. And she was tasked with organizing all the data of the state on water, on missing people, on natural resources, and on the health system. And, you know, like even like, you know, countries like Mexico, like Nigeria, like India, have the opportunity and maybe the data resources, even if not the resources, to imagine new models and start testing a funding model and, you know, an approach to AI as it was with public education. Maybe we need, and she started to test these models, and she found, for example, efficiencies in water supplies. If she integrated and cleared all the non-personal data on state systems, on water, on missing persons, and systematizing that, actually, like, I will sound like super cliche, but she found some possibilities of creating models of AI for public good, for public sector. And that gives me a little bit of hope, you know, like the same wise, researchers in Africa were doing the same with to spotting skin cancer on black skin, because there were, those data sets were missing. Of course, there's just happy examples and not, you know, like a systemic solutions. But I think that is, we shouldn't dismiss as something that can belong to the public sector and that can be repurposed for good things. Of course, it is an incredible danger, because the AI that is being deployed in the Global South right now is AI more targeting perception, targeting discrimination, as you correctly said, and control and surveillance.
Thank you all for this. We do have approximately exactly 16 minutes left, and I would like to open it up to the audience here in Linz to ask questions. There will be a microphone coming to you in a second.
Hello, and thank you for this interesting conversation where we iterate around the capitalist system, and we say then capitalism this way or that way, and feudalism. I exactly agree with you that this is not feudalism of what we have here. Shouldn't we frame it as AI and the neoliberalism? That was this neoliberal swing which we let the politicians off the hook 20, 30 years ago, when now they have all that connection lines, the companies were enabled to get all the data, get all the things. The regulation in the 70s was different. So if we just put that swing back from that neoliberalistic swing, then probably there is a chance to get the system back to those who need it, for the NGOs, for the people, for the communities. So that just a suggestion for the title, AI and neoliberalism. Thank you.
Any comments or thoughts? AI and neoliberalism, does that capture what we're talking about here, or not so much? Whoever wants to respond.
Well, I mean, I can give a very brief comment in that, if you look at it, of course, with a Eurocentric perspective, it might in fact seem that what we are describing is some kind of collapse of the welfare state, democratic capitalist model with strong trade unions, etc., and just this rise of finance and technology is a consequence of it. I just think that would in fact be extremely Eurocentric, and if you look at it from the perspective of the global South, and I'm sure that Renata will do a much better job at this now than me, but if you look at it from that perspective, it's obvious that all the horrors of this corporatization, if you will, of public life in parts of Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, they were happening at the peak of what we would call social democracy in Europe. And if you were really curious, then you have to be asking questions about the basis of that prosperity in Europe. And if you dig deep enough, in the case of the United Kingdom, but also a few other countries, you will see that partially the fantastic performance of European welfare states was a consequence of certain industries that had their roots in colonial powers, and that, to some extent, the well-being of the European welfare state and European social democracy was the unfortunate consequence of them being able to leverage the post-colonial legacy, and to some extent even the colonial legacy and the imperialist legacy. So, I mean, I don't think that neoliberalism, it all depends on the context. So if you really want to have a global perspective here, then I don't think that neoliberalism would capture it. If you really want to talk about the political economy of these things and alternatives, we have to squarely raise the question of capitalism. If you want to talk it in a very kind of nice European setting about how we can have a Minitel, which was the product of the French centralized technocratic state funded by taxpayers, then sure, we can talk about neoliberalism. But neoliberalism, its demise, it's not, by the way, a consequence of privatization, and it's not a consequence of neoliberal reforms intruding on the French state. It's the consequence of where France was in the global system, and it just couldn't compete effectively with the power of the United States. It lost, and as a result, we all have internet, we don't have Minitel.
There is another question from the audience, and you can if you want to state your name, but no pressure.
Hi, it's Helen Starr. I'm going to suggest AI and white supremacy, since I don't really think you can decouple capitalism, certainly modern capitalism, from colonialism. And I think ultimately this conversation is about power and how it's used and abused. And in none of this conversation have I heard people talk about duty of care.
Thank you so much for this question. Who would like to react to this?
I guess I'm reacting to it for lack of anyone else. So my immediate response, it's a bit similar to the other suggestions, just that I'm not personally a fan, because I mean these are very strong words that are being thrown around that I think frames that ultimately I'm not a fan personally of the framing of official titles that frame it in a very prescriptivist, very emotionally charged way in general, because I mean it makes it difficult to have a measured conversation like I think we've been able to do here. Like I think that ultimately the nature of technology companies of artificial intelligence reflects the failings of the world and the people who make it, and so certainly all of these are aspects, though perhaps feudalism does so than others. But
we bashed it enough, I think, at this point.
I don't think that white supremacy is the right word necessarily, because I would describe the power and influence of technology companies as more beholden to power, to where power lies than race. Like India is considered very important by Facebook, of course. India it's not a white nation unless you go with you classify everyone Indo-Aryan as white. Of course, I'm Chinese. I'm Chinese American. Many people who worked at Facebook are Asian, and many of them immigrants who don't come with the same perspective and background as from the United States. And so I think it's a bit simplistic to describe it in that way. And so that's the genesis for my disagreement. But others may have different opinions.
I think the question is also, I mean, there are hardly any black people working at any of the big tech companies. So they are not representative of the communities they serve. I think that is globally in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of global representation. Maybe the key question that I'm really interested in is, does it have to be one word? Do we have to put them in a hierarchy? Maybe, maybe not. Or can it be many different things at the same time?
I would say that, to your question, I would say that it is an enabler of elites globally. And elites have facilitated this supremacy of the few, over the many. Even if it's not the white dude in India, is one embodying and imposing the values of the white supremacists imposed in the US and in other countries. It's, it's the enabler of elites, basically. And that I have seen it. I have seen it with in this revolving door that I was describing earlier, enabling a system that oppressed the many and that suppressed the rights of the many. It is coded that way, and the corporate structure of these companies is established that way. Is people attending the same schools, people with record in right-wing governments often, people not really the embodiment of democracy and progressive values at all, and actually people opening the enablers of corruption that benefits corporations, that benefits a couple of states, and that mostly benefits elites and themselves, and the impunity of elites, because they don't respond because they are like corporations. They're just, it's just business. So business is unaccountable everywhere.
There's one more question from the front. I haven't forgotten you.
Hello, my name is Matthias. First of all, I'm quite happy with the title. It's okay for me, and I want to go back.
Do you want to explain why?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit provocative, and also, yeah, I think it's good. So when people are talking about the title, it's the right title, because otherwise they would not. It would not be good. It would be too normal. But I want to go back a little bit more into the content discussion when we talked about AI, and I would be curious to hear the opinions, especially of Evgeny. I mean, AI, or at least algorithms, are as good as the data you have, and there are obviously, countries or political systems where it's much more easier to gather data and also to analyze data, and it's also part of their culture when we talk about China, for example. And that's why I would say they're even on the lead in terms of AI, and also in terms of the hardware and infrastructure. When you look, like, for example, the biggest semiconductor producer is a company from Taiwan. So they have a lot of power, actually. So on the one hand, the political system, which is kind of democratic, but not really. And on the one side, you have also like the culture. So the people are used to give their data, and it's part of their understanding. And on the last point, you also have the hardware and also a lot of power in terms of infrastructure. So I would be curious to hear your opinion about this, because I think it's like this mixture of these three things is actually very hard to challenge. Also, the US, I think, is struggling a lot.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So we had a lot of questions that are actually comments, which I don't mind at all, because it sort of spices up the discussion. Just a few before we jump in. I think it's really, really difficult to say that certain cultures are more likely to share data. It's a bit, it's quite problematic. It's very complicated and nuanced. I just wanted to intervene on this point, because it's a trope in European tech policy to say, to simplify these discussions. Any more reactions from you or on the comments made? from your side?
Well, I wanted to react briefly to your, I think, comment or question as to whether we can have several words operating at once. And I think, there is no problem in framing it as a question of power or a question of, democratic alternatives. You can have as many terms as you want. But I think when we talk about words and terms that end in an ism, here we do need to make choices. And because all these terms like feudalism and capitalism, they imply certain things. If you really want to operate with them seriously, if you want to operate within some kind of neo-Marxist or, proto-Marxist philosophy of history, what follows after feudalism normally is capitalism. You cannot jump from feudalism to socialism. That's just not allowed by the precepts of the theory. So if we are now arguing that we are going back to techno-feudalism, then the only salvation for us is techno-capitalism. So all this talk about making this industry more competitive and breaking up big tech, it makes perfect sense. But then it just defines our emancipatory horizon. And this is where I think we have to be very careful, because anybody who operates with a term like feudalism has then to present some kind of a political program, or at least expect what's going to happen. So if you really think that it's feudalism, what is it that should be done? Because ultimately you get rid of feudalism through a capitalist revolution. And otherwise, none of this makes sense as a kind of serious discussion with serious categories, philosophy of history, and etc. And the question asked by the last gentleman, countries differ in various things in terms of resources and in terms of many other things. And I just wouldn't necessarily draw the normative conclusions that this somehow is bad. But this is also because I maybe have a different normative evaluation of some of these countries, and I also am a bit suspicious of the United States more than maybe other panelists. And in that sense, for me, there are other resources that a country like the United States has that a country like China doesn't, and it has to do with fantastic university infrastructure system, patents that they have accumulated even with regards to semiconductors. This is where all IP is. The fact that you have the semiconductor factory in Taiwan, it's very important when you have a shortage of semiconductors. In normal operations, it's not that important because all of the intellectual property with regards to the design of semiconductors sits in the United States, and neither China nor Taiwan are big players there. So I think we have to be a bit more contextual and approach it with a little bit of subtlety. It's not just about data and it's not just about microchips.
Thank you so much for this. Do you want to have a quick comment on this?
Yeah, and it's at the end of the day who's benefiting from it and who's profiting from it, and who's getting power out of it, and how we all contribute to it, to the AI power somehow, by either active labor or passive data points, and how invisible we are in this contribution, how how little benefit we get out of it, and at the end of the day is a repeated cycle of concentration of power and money, and again of a small group over the many, and how little imagination we have to take that possibility and power back. And how depending task on this, when we talk about digital New Deals and all of that, what is our game, our change of game, and how are we going to take back this power and redistribute it, and whether it's even possible, and what for?
We are running out of time. I want to thank you all for this really interesting discussion. It gave me lots of new ideas and perspectives. I want to thank Renata for keeping me so well hydrated during this panel. And I want to thank, very thoughtful of you, I want to thank you, Evgeny, and Sophie for joining us remotely. I know it's always a bit, I don't know, it can be exhausting and it's a bit strange, but I think we managed to still have a good exchange. So thank you very much for this. Sad that you can't be joining the dinner now, but you're there in spirit. Thank you to the audience. The AI Lab conference will continue in 30 minutes. If you're on swap card, just change over to the next session, which is called AI X Digital Humanism. So another concept that is going to be explored. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I drank more than I
Do you
did
want
in...
more?
No.
My name is Rasheen Fahandej. I'm a transdisciplinary artist and documentary filmmaker. My practice and research meets at the juncture of art, technology, and social practice, and the processes embrace community co-creation.
Gâteau, papa est en bas, qui fait du chocolat. Fais dodo, Maya, mon petit frère, fais dodo, roi du lolo.
My approach to art making is deeply informed by my personal experiences as a woman, as a member of persecuted Baha'i minority in Iran, as an immigrant in the United States, and as an educator. As a socially engaged artist, I define my practice as art as ecosystem, which is a network of collaborations with individuals, communities, and institutions. Community co-creation process forms opportunities for cross-sector collaborations that is centered on personal stories. And in this space of storytelling, personal and political realities of an intersectional issues such as race, gender, immigration, and caste becomes fluid. And from that holistic fluid space of narrative, art as ecosystem emerges.
My mother was my mother was my mother was my mother. Entonces la nena se alegrará en la danza. Los jóvenes y viejos juntamente.
In the United States, there are 2.7 million children with parents in prison or jail. Also, 92% of parents in prison are fathers.
Alegraré, alegraré.
A Father's Lullaby is a multi-year community co-creative initiative that highlights the role of men in raising children and also focuses on their absence due to racial disparities in criminal justice system in the United States and its direct impact on children and women of lower income communities. The project centers on the voices of absent fathers. But at the same time, it's a call to all community members to participate by singing lullabies and sharing memories of their childhood. A majority of fathers that I spoke to, this issue has become multi-generational. Most of the fathers were raised with single mothers who had to work 2 jobs to provide for their family just to survive. And hunger, food security was major challenge in their childhood, as well as experience of trauma and violence, and they got into the system as a child. So this becomes a very much a philosophical question for a nation, that what are we doing for our next generation if we are dismantling this nuclear space that provide care and nurturing for children?
I really never knew my father. The last time I seen him, it was like 12 years old, so.
Co-creation and participation engages diverse group of collaborators from multiple perspectives that they are mobilized through this sort of moral responsibility that everyone needs to speak to social injustices, not just those who are most impacted by it. Intimate interviews, song, lullabies offer a poetic meditation on the space of love, trauma, presence, and absence. And they intend to bring us together to envision a different world for children of now and children of future.
Get another indictment to him and his friends are riding in the car. They get pulled over.
3 generations.
Then they arrest him for
It was my 7-year-old son, it was me and my father. My 7-year-old son, me and my father.
They were grounded, just any young black around.
Put handcuffs on my father. My son seeing this happen, and you can hear it in his voice like,
A life is a life.
The result of this ongoing community collaboration, technology and tool sharing workshops and educational program manifest in site-responsive installations and immersive spaces, as well as a participatory geolocated website. I define A Father's Lullaby as a poetic cyber movement for social justice because the intention is for the art to mobilize a plethora of voices and by creating connections between public places and virtual spaces. I employ sound and video interventions on the neighborhood, both as a participation and reflection site. Touch panels create this beautiful opportunity for encounter. When participants touch would activate the father's story, and as long as they're holding their touch, they can hear the audio. And these audios each represent one father's narrative. Presence and absence are major theme in this work, and how that absence manifests in the lives of children. Each father talks about what it was like to serve time in prison, how it affected their children and families, and how their own childhoods mirror their children's experiences. Through this multiplicity of fathers' stories, it really makes the systemic issue much more apparent, and it brings attention to the web that inherently connects many forms of injustices. Pedagogy has been always intertwined with my artistic practice. As an extension of A Father's Lullaby project, we launched a pioneering initiative at Emerson College in partnership with U.S. Federal Probation Office Nurturing Fatherhood Program. Student probation officers and formerly incarcerated fathers with their children collaborate using virtual reality, augmented reality, 360 videos, and they create a series of media projects to reflect on the system through the intimate perspective of their own personal stories. Community co-creation responds to this critical inquiry that in order to create meaningful social change in a significant capacity, the process should embody the envisioned goal.
When I first got sentenced, I was sentenced to 360 months, which is 30 years. My 28-year-old son now, he was 7 years old. And the twins, they were 45 days old. Now, I've just been released a few months ago. They're 21 now.
Where are you going, my baby, my own? Turn around and you're too.
The main question from all three of them at different times was, why did you leave me?